Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Brain, our week-long series of conversations and presentations by brain science researchers at the University of Minnesota. I'm Holly Menninger. I'm the Director of Public Engagement and Science Learning at the Bell Museum. The University of Minnesota is a real powerhouse in the field of brain science, and we at the Bell are thrilled to collaborate with researchers and showcase their work. Over the course of this week on Facebook Live and later through recorded videos posted to our website, you'll meet researchers across all career levels in the fields of psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, and neurology, learn more about their work, and even go inside research labs and equipment. Why are we so focused on brains? Well, this Thursday, October 15th, the Bell Museum debuts an original planetarium production called Mysteries of Your Brain. We'll be showcasing this new animated film all weekend long, and then it'll be shown daily as part of our regular schedule. Before I introduce our special guest today, I'd like to thank Boston Scientific for their generous support of brain-related programs and activities at the museum. Okay, let's put on our thinking caps and welcome today's guest. Mari Gades is a Ph.D. candidate in the Cognitive and Brain Sciences program at the University of Minnesota, studying tobacco addiction. In her free time, she enjoys baking, walking the dog, and teaching kids capoeira, a martial art. Her favorite people to talk to about science with are elementary school kids. Welcome, Mari.
Hi, Holly. It's so great to be here.
We are so glad to have you. So today we're going to talk about your research on tobacco addiction and the different approaches that can be used to help people stop smoking. In other words, can we use e-cigarettes to do good? So let's start by talking about what smoking tobacco does to the brain. Can you talk about the drugs in tobacco and why they are so addictive?
Absolutely. So in tobacco, and when we talk about tobacco, we're talking about a lot of different things. We have cigarettes, which I think is maybe what most people are familiar with, but we can also talk about things like cigars, or some people think about hookah, which is called water pipe. And all of these things have something called nicotine in them. And nicotine is this really addictive drug. And what I mean by that is nicotine will get into your brain and it will essentially make you feel really good. And it makes you feel so good that you have to use it over and over and over again. At first, it's because it feels really, really good. But then at some point, it's because when you don't have it in your system, you start to feel bad. And so you have to get back to normal at some point. So nicotine addiction can be really powerful in that way. And that's why it's so hard for people to quit smoking.
When it comes to the brain, you mentioned like some of the different ways that nicotine and tobacco can be used. What's the difference between cigarettes and vaping or e-cigarettes in terms of like the delivery of nicotine and how they work?
That's a great question. So cigarettes and vaping or e-cigarettes, they both deliver nicotine to your brain in a similar way. So you inhale it and it'll go through your lungs and it'll get into your brain. But it seems like vaping gets there a little bit slower, and it probably takes a little bit more nicotine in the vaping e-liquid, what we call it, to get as much nicotine in your brain. So smoking seems to give you more nicotine more quickly. And the quicker you can get that big thing of nicotine, the better it feels. And so it seems like e-cigarettes aren't as rewarding as cigarettes, but they're doing the same thing.
When vaping's been in the news a lot lately, and particularly about the concern about the harm it may pose to youth and young adults. Is there a difference in how vaping affects young people versus adults, and why are those concerns emerging? Why are we hearing about it in the news?
Yeah, so it's funny because it's not necessarily that it's vaping itself that is the big thing that's affecting adolescents or youth kids more than adults. It's the nicotine inside of the vaping. So nicotine can slow your development. So if you are vaping or smoking really early on, it can be really harmful to your brain. Our brains keep developing until we're like 25. which is a long time. And so even when you're a young adult, if you are smoking or you are vaping and you're getting that nicotine in your system, it can cause like risk later on even of other what we call psychiatric disorders. So things like depression or anxiety can happen later on, and they're more likely to happen if you are a smoker or a vapor. And I think the reason that we're hearing so much about it with vaping and kids is just because it has suddenly become so popular. And so we didn't really know what to do about it. And the other scary thing about it is we know cigarettes are bad, right? We know what cigarettes do, but we don't know as much about e-cigarettes. So it's really scary when suddenly all your kids are using this thing that you actually don't know what it's going to do to their brain over time.
Maybe we can talk a little bit more about your specific research project. So you were trying to understand how vaping or e-cigarettes might be useful to help people stop smoking. Could you give people an overview of what you're doing with that research?
Yeah, so the whole idea behind this is, so tobacco is the number one preventable cause of death in the United States, the number one. So this is preventable, right? Number two is things like bad eating, and number three is alcohol. But tobacco is number one, and it's because it can cause lung disease, heart disease, cancers. It makes you get sick easier. It can cause diabetes. And a lot of that is in the cigarettes themselves. So when you set tobacco on fire, which is what you do in cigarettes, then that is what can cause most of these things. The nicotine can be really bad for development, but it's not necessarily what's causing cancer. And so when we think about e-cigarettes, we aren't setting it on fire. You are heating it up in a way that vaporizes a liquid, but it's a little bit different. And so I want to bring up something called harm reduction, because I think that's a really important idea. And here's my question to you. So if you had a choice between falling and scraping your knee really, really badly, so it's going to hurt, or if you had a choice, or if you had to fall and lose your entire foot, which one would you choose?
Do you want me to answer, or
yeah.
do you want the audience? Scrape my knee, please. I don't want to lose my foot.
Right. So they're both harmful. They're both bad for you, right? But you're going to choose the less harmful one. Now, if I add in the choice to not get hurt at all, you're probably going to choose that one, right? But here's the thing about people who are addicted to nicotine. Sometimes somebody can be so addicted that that zero harm choice isn't actually there for them anymore. Maybe they've tried quitting a million times or cutting down, or maybe they've tried using something like nicotine patches or nicotine gum, which you hear about all the time, but it's not working for them. And for those people, you want to give them something that's less bad. It's still not safe, but it's less bad because it might help them. And the reason we might want something like an e-cigarette over something like nicotine patches, which you just slap on and it delivers nicotine through your skin, is cigarette smoking is not just about the nicotine, but there's also what we would call like a behavioral part of addiction, where these people are used to taking a break, taking out your cigarette, lighting it, puffing on it. And so there are these things that people do every single time, and they get used to those as well. And so those patches, they're not satisfying these people. And for those people who don't feel like they have any other choice, we want to give them a choice that is less bad, but I want to reiterate, not zero harm.
Gotcha. So how do you do your research in this way? And do you recruit a bunch of people who are trying to stop smoking? Like, tell us a little bit about your methods and your approach to studying this.
Yeah, so I've done, our lab works a lot with clinical trials, right? So we hear a lot about clinical trials right now because that's how we're getting our COVID vaccines. It's the idea of you want to see if something will help people's health overall. And it's a little different with things like e-cigarettes. And one thing that we've done in our lab is we have actually asked smokers who were not interested in quitting to completely switch to an electronic cigarette for like 8 weeks. And then you kind of see what they do. And you can also measure things like nicotine in their urine, as well as toxicants and carcinogens. So these are those harmful things that you can find in tobacco smoke that we're still trying to figure out how much of them you can find in vaping as well. So we can measure all of these things to look at harm, to look at how well these smokers are like using these. So are they actually using? Are they cheating and just smoking their cigarettes the whole time, which some of them are? And so you can do trials like that where you legitimately just ask people to use this product for a specified amount of time. And then at the end, you kind of say, well, did it work? Did they actually stop smoking? Did they actually use this other device? And then another thing that we can do, which is something that I'm doing right now. Well, I was going to be doing right now, but I have to, I'm starting it up now because obviously research has been stopped for a little while. But one thing that I'm doing right now is I'm kind of just interested in how smokers think about and feel about an electronic cigarette after they use it the first time, right? Because if you use it the first time and you hate it, you're never going to use it again. And so I'm going to be measuring things like, how do you feel about it? How much would you pay for it? And then sending them home with an e-cigarette and saying, use this, and then tell me how you use it. And so these are kind of the ways that we can get at how smokers feel about e-cigarettes and also what parts of the e-cigarettes they care about the most. I'm really interested in the nicotine concentration. So how much nicotine is in them, because obviously nicotine is kind of that addictive part of it, but also flavor, because flavor, as if anybody here has heard anything on the news about e-cigarettes, it's probably about flavor and how fun the flavors are. And in January, they banned flavors that weren't tobacco or menthol from like pod devices. So this would be like the Juuls. But you can still get them in other e-cigarette devices, which a lot of people aren't talking about as much. So that's kind of what I am interested in, is how they feel about these things. And that might tell somebody like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, who actually gets to regulate e-cigarettes. They get to tell them what to do. It might help them figure out, oh, do we have too much nicotine in e-cigarettes even for smokers? Like, do we need nicotine that goes up to like 50 milligrams per milliliter, or can it be down at 20, which is what they do in the UK actually? And do we need all these flavors? Is tobacco and menthol enough? Things like that. So those are kind of the things that I am interested in.
That sounds really, really fascinating. I'm always interested in talking to scientists about like their origins stories and what put you on the path to getting a degree in cognitive and brain sciences and to pursuing some of these research questions. What inspired and motivated you to do this line of work?
Yeah, so there were a lot of things that I think came together, because when I was a kid, I wasn't interested in science. I was going to be a writer, and then I was going to be an editor because my mom's a journalist. Hi, Mom. I know you're out there. And so she was always writing and editing, and that's what I grew up with, and I loved it. And I thought, oh, I'm going to do that, or I'm going to teach English. And then in high school, I had this psychology teacher in AP psychology, and she was so excited about everything she taught. And it was contagious. And I got really, really excited about psychology. I thought, ooh, maybe I'm going to be a therapist, or I'm going to teach psychology, or be a researcher. And I started to get interested in that. And I majored in it in college. And then I got into a grad program, and I specifically was interested in addiction because I actually knew people in middle and high school who suffered from addiction. And I think there's just part of you that it sits there and you think like, how could I help them? And I knew I couldn't help them then, but like, how can I help other people who are having these troubles? So that's kind of how I got where I am.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's always really interesting to me to kind of understand sort of how their interest in science developed and the people that inspired them along the way. So thanks for that. So I know that right now that you're teaching a class right now. So in addition to doing your research, you're teaching a class on addiction and recovery. And I was wondering, sort of kind of going along the themes of that class, what are some of the common misconceptions that people, whether it's your students or the public have about drugs and addiction? What do you wish people understood but don't?
Yeah, so I love this question, and I start classes like this, or in other classes when I've taught about drugs and addiction, I always start by talking about sort of the way that addiction is portrayed in the media. So how do we see addiction, and how has it been viewed in the past? And this time I actually went through the legislation that's associated with addiction. And I think that was the most eye-opening part, because a lot of what happens with the way we view addiction is that it is like a moral failing. It is sinful. It is an individual. So it's like the addicted person's fault, right? They could just stop using at any time. It's a choice. And you hear these all the time, and you see this in movies, and you see this in our legislation and our regulation, right? Originally, this is a maybe a fun fact, this may be a sad fact, but originally the way that we regulated drugs didn't have anything to do with the user. So people could use whatever they wanted, but the people who were selling it to them had to label it correctly and had to make sure it was safe and make sure it was effective. And then suddenly around abolition time, so when they decided that alcohol was a no-no in the early 1900s, then suddenly everybody was also not allowed to use it. And the way that they made that work is they were saying, well, if you use alcohol, you are a bad person. So that started. And then in the, not even that much later, they passed an act that we call the Narcotics Act today, but it actually had not as much to do with that in the day. But the idea was that people who were using things like opium and cocaine, which at the time was predominantly Chinese immigrants and Black people in the South, that they were the bad people. So this also becomes a social justice issue at the same time. And that's how it has been used in the past. And so drug addiction is, generally speaking, not an individual's fault, which sounds weird to say, right? Because they did choose to use the drug at the first time. But only like 15 to 20% of people who use drugs get addicted to drugs. So there are other factors at play. And it can be genetics. It can be a really bad situation you're in, right? It can be maybe you are around other people who are using drugs a lot. So I think the thing that I really want people to understand is that drug addiction is not about being weak, right? In healthcare, being sick and getting through something has nothing to do with how strong or weak somebody is. And that's the same with addiction. It's not a battle. It just happens sometimes. And there are things that society can do to make it easier on those people. And those are probably going to be much more helpful than doing things like sending them to jail or punishing them. If there's anything I have learned from psychology, it's that punishment is a really bad way of teaching somebody something.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. I want to remind our audience that if you have questions for Mari today, now's your chance to ask them. And so we'd encourage you to type those in the comment section associated with our live feed today. And I'm not sure. I think our audience is being a little bit shy, Mari, so I'm going to keep asking questions for another minute or two. Hopefully, people may have some inspiration. One of the things that has kind of emerged to me, and going back to vaping and e-cigarettes and the time that we're in right now with COVID, is there any particular connection or like specific health concerns between sort of the people who are vaping or using e-cigarettes and their susceptibility to COVID?
There is. So I actually looked this up for everybody because I thought that this question would come up. The idea, so there's a few different things. So smoking and vaping are both linked to a higher risk of things like lung diseases and infections. And COVID, we can think of as a lung disease. So there's not a whole lot of information on whether smoking and vaping increases your risk of getting COVID, but there is evidence out there that shows that smoking and vaping is both of them, not just smoking, which I would expect it to mostly be smoking, but it's vaping as well, are also related to what are worse outcomes for people who get COVID. So if you do get COVID, you are more likely to have it worse than if you did not smoke or vape. So this can include things like hospital visits or really long-term effects. I mean, you can imagine if you have a lung illness and you're smoking, that cough isn't going to go away, or you might feel more tired all the time. And I think the scary part of that is the more hospital visits. So more people have been admitted to the ICU who are smokers with COVID than who aren't. And I think that's the big thing that we are learning right now. There's still a lot to know, obviously. So science is pretty slow, and COVID is not. And so we're kind of trying to keep up, but it's hard when so the way that scientists get information to other scientists is usually through publishing, and publishing can take forever. I was lucky enough to get an article published in like 6 months after I submitted it. And so thinking about things like that, the rest of the science community may or may not know as much about COVID and smoking. And so this was what I could find so far. But I have a feeling that even if people who smoke and vape aren't more likely to get COVID, I do think that the science out there is saying that they are more likely to have bad COVID.
Gotcha. Well, it appears our audience is still very shy this morning. But we've been able to have a really, I think, interesting discussion. You opened up my eyes to a lot of things around your research. So thank you for that. Is there a place, Mari, where members of our audience, if they want to learn more about your research or information about how to stop smoking, is there a place where you would send people to go?
Yeah, so if you're really interested in more information on things like smoking or vaping, one of the big things that I use is the CDC website, actually. They have some really good information, the CDC website and the FDA website, actually, because they keep things up to date, which I really like. And they'll include things like how it affects COVID, and they'll give you some really good statistics. CDC is very good at giving pretty graphs, which I appreciate and I use in my lectures all the time. So I think those are probably the best places to go for stuff like that. If you're interested in the kinds of work that we're doing at the University of Minnesota and the tobacco research programs, which is what I'm part of right now, I would have to go look up the website real quick.
You don't have to worry about that. We'll take care of that, and we will put that in the comments associated with our Facebook feed. So there you go. Oops, it looks like, we have a question. Amber, Amber's working behind the scenes monitoring the questions. Amber, do you want to jump in with an audience question?
Absolutely. So Robin has a question, and she said, I have heard that research is being done on addiction pathways of the brain using light therapy to help break those pathways. Do you know anything about this?
Light therapy. I actually don't know anything about that. So when I hear light therapy, what I think of is sort of like a happy light, which I'm going to be really nerdy here and show you my happy light, which gets you through things like seasonal affective disorder. If you just need a little bit more light in the morning. So that's what I think of when I think of light therapy. And I'm not sure how it would be used with addiction. It's used with things like depression. So I wouldn't be surprised if somehow it ended up working on other parts of the brain. So what's so interesting with the brain, right, and with treatment of some of these disorders is that everything in the brain is connected to some degree. And so I wouldn't be surprised if light therapy worked with addiction, but I personally don't know anything about that. It sounds super cool. I hope it works.
So thank you, Robin, for asking your question. And well, I think we are just about out of time today. So I want to thank you, Mari, for joining us. And thank you to our audience for joining us for this installment of Brain to Brain this morning. Special thanks to Boston Scientific for their support of brain-related programs and activities at the Bell Museum. We hope you can come back and join us later today at 4 p.m. to hear from Dr. Rich Lee about some exciting research being done to help us understand our attitudes and well-being in the face of COVID-19. We've posted a link to the entire Brain to Brain schedule of live programs in the comments box below. We hope you all have a wonderful day and take care of your noggins.